Okay, we'll go ahead. We'll go ahead and get started to keep everybody on schedule, and so you'll all be able to get out and see all the speakers that are coming up on the main stage after this. My name is Larry Hart. I work with the American Conservative Union Foundation as a senior fellow, and this is a conversation about a phrase that's become more prevalent in this country and others, crony capitalism. And with me is someone that is probably one of the great writers we have on this topic. If you have not read his columns in the Washington Examiner, go out and look them up. Tim Crony. And Tim, I first met Tim when he worked for one of the idols of my youth in political writing, Bob Novak. Bob Novak, one of the things that he liked to say was that he was proud of the fact that he never got invited to either political party's big fundraisers and dinners and so forth because he was an equal opportunity critic. One of the, I think, my experience in Washington, and it's been over the decades, is that the most frightening word in town is bipartisan. When you hear that word, it's usually something not very good. And one of the characteristics of crony capitalism is that it is bipartisan. And I've learned this by the major project I work on for the American Conservative Union Foundation is our new state legislative rating project, which for the first time this year will...
You're too close to the mic.
Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry. It's hard for me to tell. Is that for the first time we will rate all 50 state legislatures. And one of the things that I learned from doing this, it's been quite an education, is how prevalent this issue is. And the other thing that we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about is what are we talking about when we talk about crony capitalism, and why why has it been substituted for the free market capitalism that many of us support? So let me turn it over to Tim, and then we can have a little conversation about that.
Okay. No, thank you. And I like to write and talk about crony capitalism a lot at the Examiner. I do a fellowship at the American Enterprise Institute, and I think the way I don't always use the term crony capitalism. We can talk about language because that probably matters in discussing this, but what I would say is this. If you care about free enterprise, the single biggest threat to free enterprise today is actually the big business lobby. It's not going to be Bernie Sanders. He doesn't win. He doesn't get his, giant, he doesn't get to socialize the country. He doesn't get to win. The big business lobby, it wins. When you get a giant government intervention, in the last 20 years, any giant government intervention in the economy, almost all of them have been supported by and to the benefit of big business and to the detriment of small businesses, taxpayers, consumers, the economy as a whole. And big business is the biggest threat because it fools our guys. It fools people into saying, oh, well, I'm against government intervention because I'm pro-business, but if even business is in support of this, then it must be okay. And then C, it sort of fools the middle. It fools any, moderates who are paying attention. It fools the media into thinking, well, there must be consensus if you have even big business and big government on the same side. And anybody disagreeing is just a crazy tea partier. And the best example I give is the light bulb example. The current chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee is Fred Upton, pretty conservative Republican from Michigan. When he was trying to become chairman of the committee, people asked him, okay, but why did you co-sponsor the light bulb ban? It's not actually a ban. It's a regulation that, in effect, bans the traditional incandescent light bulb. And his answer was, well, I wouldn't have been for it, but even GE and even Sylvania said it was fine, so I figured that it was fine. And GE and Sylvania actually helped write the law. And why did they write this law? Well, just the short version of it, because I want to talk with Larry a little more. They basically had near zero profit margins on the traditional light bulb. And that's what's great about capitalism, right? It's not giant profits. Capitalism is not about giant profits. Capitalism is about market forces making the profits tiny, so people have to innovate, so we as the consumers get the surplus. So they made fancier light bulbs, and nobody was buying them. Those horrible fluorescent bulbs, nobody was buying them. So they turned to government, and they lobbied, and they shut down some GE factories, but GE was fine because it was making the bulbs over in the fluorescents over in China, and basically made it into the Bernie Sanders caricature of capitalism, which is we now have to buy something that we don't want, that's more expensive than what we want, and that has large profit margins because there's more narrow competition. In regular light bulbs, there wasn't huge competition, but there was always the threat of competition, and that kept profit margins tiny. The light bulb ban never would have gone into effect if it was just the Natural Resources Defense Council. Obamacare never would have passed if you didn't have the drug lobby and the hospital lobby on board with it. The environmental stuff that almost passed early in the Obama administration, that had British Petroleum, General Electric, all these people also backing it. So I think that if you are fighting for free enterprise, the most important battlefront today is a fight against the big businesses that seek special favors, that seek regulations to crush small competitors, and that seek handouts. That's the main battle today.
Let me ask you, this is, I think if you go around college campuses, not only in the United States, but in any country in the world, and ask young people about what do you think of capitalism, they would have a very negative reaction. And what I have thought about is what do they think of when you use that term? Do they think of the free market and the free enterprise system that this country stands for? Or do they think about the crony capitalist system that not only is here, probably China is the biggest example of it these days, but all countries around the world that practice this, support for big business at the expense of the small entrepreneur?
I mean, I think there's a mixture. I think you will find lots of college kids who are out-and-out socialists, who don't think that anybody should be richer than anybody else and don't like the fact that, prices are set by the market instead of the government. So you will find a lot of that. But I think the thrust of your question is correct, that Michael Moore made a movie about capitalism. It was a great attack on corporatism and crony capitalism. It was about big guys using their connections to power to crush smaller people. It was an amazing movie. If they had just changed the name to corporatism or crony capitalism, it's a movie I could have made almost. And so that's what a lot of people think of. And some of it is the effects so monopoly. There are times when monopolies arise in free markets, but for the overwhelming trend is that monopolies can only maintain a monopoly status and sort of exploit monopoly power when government is involved. There's a great book I read called The Triumph of Conservatism, written in the 70s by a socialist named Gabriel Kolko. And conservatism doesn't mean this conservatism. It meant preservation of the status quo. And it was about how, under Teddy Roosevelt, a lot of what Roosevelt was doing was at the request of big businesses who wanted their cartels to be protected, who wanted their monopolies to be protected, the big meat packers loved that Upton-Sinclair meatpacking law because the smaller guys couldn't afford it. So I think that a lot of the perception and the idea that it contributes to inequality and the idea that it creates monopoly and the idea that these guys are in bed with government, a lot of that is driven by the conflation of free enterprise and corporatism or crony capitalism. And half the problem, though, again, is conservatives and Republicans sometimes don't distinguish between them. They say, I am pro-business. And so when Republicans had caught on to the Solyndra thing, the solar panel maker that had gotten all these government-backed loan guarantees, there was Ed Markey, then a congressman, probably learned this from Barney Frank, who was an expert at drawing out the contradictions in conservatives' arguments. And Ed Markey said, so I'm glad that we now oppose government loan guarantees for energy programs, because I want to point to this giant loan guarantee that goes to a Southern company based in Georgia, and coal, nuclear. And one Republican from Georgia stepped up. He said, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's not conflate Solyndra and Southern Company. Southern Company is a great, successful corporation, and it's got all these profits, and it employs all these people, while Solyndra is some podunk fly-by-night thing. So let's not conflate the loan guarantees for Southern Company with the loan guarantees for Solyndra. So at that point, the Republican position was subsidies from the government are okay for large profitable corporations, but not for small corporations trying a new technology. That is the sort of thing that, so if college students have that misperception, it's not just because their high school teachers don't explain what capitalism is, that's half of it. It's because Republicans make it often confuse them into doing it. I think it's gotten a lot better in the last few years, but it's still a problem where when Marco Rubio steps up there and says, I'm for free enterprise, but these sugar industries down in Florida, they need protection, that contributes to exactly that confusion that you're referring to.
One other quick question, and just playing devil's advocate, because you see this a lot, and looking through these state legislatures, and let's for questions. But this past fall in Nevada, the Republican governor, with a Republican legislature for the first time in decades, brought the legislature back into special session to pass one bill. It was $335 million in incentives, $250 million tax credits, $120 million in public financing for a company called Faraday Futures, backed by a Chinese billionaire, to build electric cars in 2020, even though they've never had.
Or to build batteries for the electric
batteries
cars.
for
Yeah.
electric cars, that's correct. So, vast majority of Republicans voted for this. They would tell you, this is great for our economy. This will help bring jobs to Nevada. What is wrong with it?
So I guess I have three responses to that. One is going to be on sort of the states competing against one another. One is a specific lesson from how the economic damage of these things go out there. And a third is sort of on the importance of messaging and being willing to fight against the bad guys. So I'll say this. Republicans a lot of times are afraid to go after corporations, especially ones that do good and innovative stuff. General Electric does amazing stuff, and it gets attacked for stupid reasons. Boeing, the government tries to keep them from putting a plant in South Carolina. And so these guys are attacked by the bad guys, so we automatically defend them. Elon Musk owns Tesla, and Tesla was a company that this is a feeder company to in Nevada. So they make plug-in electric cars. Elon Musk is an incredible innovator, incredible entrepreneur. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be willing to say, here is a multimillionaire who's benefiting from taxpayers, that there has to be a willingness to, A, call them out so they feel some shame, and B, the left gets a lot of mileage out of fighting bad guys who are rich and stealing your money. And they think stealing your money means not paying all their money in taxes. We say stealing your money means actually transferring money from taxpayers to these people. That has to be part of the fight in defense of capitalism and against big government. So that's the first point. Second point is, a lot of the problems, the destruction from these sort of programs comes not just from the fact that it's taxpayer money going to them, but the cost to the economy. So sugar program, export-import bank, ethanol program, those all have very little on-budget cost to taxpayers. What they do is they hurt the economy in all sorts of ways. Economists are very good at explaining, but in this Tesla battery case, there's a very interesting example. Some supplier to this battery plant explained to a reporter, well, we were actually dealing with and experimenting and selling about 10 different battery technologies, and all of them have a lot of potential, but we know not all of them will work. We're not sure what we're going to do, and we're really excited about the future of batteries, but we're scrapping 9 of those technologies now because this battery plant just wants lithium-ion batteries. So now we're just going to do this, and we know this battery plant is going to make money, and it's going to get built because it was subsidized. So then you see when government picks winners, it picks losers. So it's not just that some companies failed. It's that where the market was going to drive towards innovation and experimentation, because this is why we believe in free enterprise, right? Because nobody knows the right answer. Here, by driving consolidation, it's taking away the innovation. There are now 9 battery technologies that are not going to be explored at all. But the final point, and this is really sticky, what do you do if you're a governor and somebody says, we're going to bring a factory to either your state or one of these 2 other states, what are you going to give us? Or if you're a governor, say you're Scott Walker, and the Milwaukee Bucks say, we're going to get up and move away unless you give us a subsidy. So Scott Walker does this really really rough math and says the taxes brought in by the Milwaukee Bucks being in the state are this much, so I'm going to give them an incentive that over 10 years is smaller, and it ends up being net profitable. It's really bad math. It presumes literally that nothing would take the place of the Bucks if they left. It presumes literally that money couldn't somehow be spent any other way. It's saying that I trust government directing this money more than the market. And so a lot of times they end up hurting themselves. Sports stadiums, there's tons of economic data doing that. On these other businesses, I understand why a governor feels tempted to do that, because politically it's tough. What if you said, we're not going to bribe any companies to come into our state. We're going to cut our taxes. We're going to make our tax code simple and fair and easy to understand. We're going to reduce our regulations down to only the ones that are necessary. And we're going to have better school systems, and we're going to have good infrastructure. And what would you do? You wouldn't get these giant guys who can get bribes from other governors, right? You would get every business that wasn't able to get bribes from other governors, and your state would be better off. But politically, if you're the governor, that doesn't get you the big ribbon-cutting ceremony. Sandoval in Nevada is going to be able to say, I brought this factory here. While my imaginary free market anti-cronyism governor would say, there are 5,000 new small businesses in this state. Which ones are here because of you? I can't tell. It's the aggregate effect of the economy. So the political incentives are against them. I'm not smart enough to come up with the way to fix that, but we have to align the political incentives for that. One solution might be all the Midwestern governors these days are Republicans who are basically conservative. They should enter into a multilateral disarmament pact, that they won't try to bribe businesses away from one another and slowly build down their sort of slush funds for that sort of thing. But I mean, I don't know if that would work, but that's the best idea I can come up with.
Thanks, Tim. So we have a few minutes left to open it up.
Would the World Trade Organization of States kind of work on something like that?
Yeah, so the WTO forces countries to reduce their subsidies, and it's possible you could do that. As a conservative, I'm always hesitant to create a new organization. I mean, the WTO in a few years is going to be forcing us to cap our greenhouse gases or emissions or something like that. But something along those lines. I mean, that's why I'm thinking a multi-state pact among governors that build this up. I don't know. I'm pretty skeptical that we can do it, except if you had a governor who was strong enough and powerful and served 2 terms and could, at the end of 8 years, point to the success he had in bringing in sort of the politically unfavored industries. Everybody's going for biotech and Hollywood are like the top 2. And then after that, there are others like, yeah, and they all get tons of subsidies. And I mean, it's good to have stuff like the state level thing. And at AEI, one of the things I'm going to try to build, and I'm going to tap into your knowledge on this, is sort of a checklist to give to these legislators. These guys run for state senate and they say, I'm against corporate welfare, but they don't really know what it means. They think it just means Solyndra. So at AEI, we gave something to members of Congress saying, if you're against corporate welfare, here's 30 programs you can abolish, with paragraphs explaining it all. And some of them were like, this is great. I didn't know these things existed. Now I have something. And Rubio read it and went after the risk corridors, and other people read it and said, okay, we're going to kill the Export-Import Bank, and that was killed for a few months. On the states, it would be too hard to list everyone on every state, but sort of a checklist. Here's the ones that appear. Does your state have this sort of slush fund? Does it have this? And have them go after. Part of it would just be communicating to these people, this is anti-free enterprise, and some of those conservative state legislators would turn around.
The other thing that occurred to me as I go through these votes in the various states is when you give somebody, say, $200 million a tax break for $200 million, which everybody should get tax breaks. It's
Yeah.
wonderful. But then they have a constitutional duty to balance the budget in every state. Now, in the federal government, they just keep increasing the deficit. But in the states, they actually have to balance the budget. So if there's, at least for the time being, they're saying, well, 5 years from now, they're going to be doing all this stuff when they build this. In the meantime, there's $200 million less in revenue that they would be getting. Then guess what? What do they have to do? Well, somebody has to pay for that. And usually then they come back and say, well, gee, we have this big budget hole. I guess we're going to have to raise some taxes.
Yep.
So there's a lot of problems.
Is there a hero politician across the country that you think best demonstrates this commitment?
So what I would say, I can't think of a governor off the top of my head. Rick Snyder sort of talked that way in the beginning. He got rid of the tax credits, but not some of the funds. You have in South Carolina, Boeing is a big presence there. You have Mick Mulvaney and Jim DeMint when he was in the Senate were people who stood up and said, I know, Boeing, you want this. I fight against every government intrusion in your ability to do business, Boeing, and I'll keep doing it, even more so because we have employees here, but I'm not going to support government subsidies for you. And in fact, I'll fight against government subsidies for Airbus, your competitor, but I'm not going to support government subsidies for you. And when you consistently stand on principle and articulate it, people will accept that. Not everybody. A lot of Boeing people raise money and fund it against guys who did this, but a lot of them respect it. And one of the best examples is Ted Cruz winning Iowa. Again, I don't have a favorite candidate, but I will admit I was rooting for Ted Cruz to win Iowa. He was the firmest opponent of the ethanol mandate, and he got more votes in Iowa than any candidate in the history of the Iowa caucuses. And what does that show you? It shows you that while half of the Republicans support the ethanol mandate, only about 5% of them actually vote on the ethanol mandate. And I talked to ethanol mandates corn farmers who said, well, I support Cruz. A, he stands up for what he believes in, and that's free market. And so while I think the ethanol mandate is good for X, Y, and Z reasons, B, he's going to take down oil subsidies too. C, he's doing this to wind and solar and everybody else who's at the trough. So I think that's great. And I think ethanol in a free and open market can compete. I don't think that guy's right on the economics of it, but I think he's taking the moral right stand. And that, yeah, you'll lose people. You'll lose donors. But these guys think, oh, there's a big vote for Boeing subsidies in South Carolina. No, there isn't. They think that because 100 people come to their office and say, you have to support these subsidies. Those are the only 100 people in your district who are going to vote that way. So I would say Cruz's performance in Iowa has the possibility to really make it clear there is no broad public support. There's no corporate welfare vote. I wish there was an anti-corporate welfare vote. It's not quite there, but there is no pro-corporate welfare vote.
Take one, if that's okay.
So I agree in principle with what you say, but, you know, we've seen things where they kind of sort of work. So I have a lot of association with Kentucky, and Martha Lane Collins, a Democrat, was in power when Toyota made the decision in Kentucky. So she threw out a bunch of tax breaks for Kentucky for them to settle with. There's 200 small businesses now feeding around that Toyota plant. You've got hundreds of thousands of workers whose income tax now goes to the state of Kentucky. And so it's not quite as clean as what you would say that, okay, you've got a tax break and nothing else coming in. Because if it's horrible if you pick the right crony, right?
Yeah.
You're gonna, if you pick the right flagship, you can make the economics work. And I think it's probably worked for Kentucky, although I would say Cylinders and Boeing and some of these others are a farce. Of course, Boeing makes millions on it.
Well, so there's a couple responses to that. So I've spent a lot of time when I was writing about the Export-Import Bank studying the economic literature where they've done empirical and then sort of the theoretical work on when support for companies works. And the argument is that if it's a poor developing country, that a little bit can work to get an industry started. But even if it's an infant industry in a developed country, it ends up being economically counterproductive. So in Spain, it's like, we're going to do windmills. And that ended up being a failure. And so maybe you could argue that Kentucky is a third world country, but I think more likely it ends up being counterproductive in a lot of these places. Or, and Haley Barbour would argue that about Mitsubishi and Airbus, ironically, down in Mississippi. And so it's possible that in a very poor state, it could work. And that a state might want to redistribute wealth from, say, Chicago to some poor part of Illinois. That is going to suppress the overall economic well-being of Illinois, but it's redistributive in a way that maybe they say, okay, well, that's fair. But the fact is, when you look at these deals, just to go in a little more detail on and an economist could lay it out better than I could, but it's to say we gave them this much in tax credits and overall the net effect was this much is again presuming that if Toyota hadn't come in, that nobody would have come in. Opportunity costs. And that Toyota, and I haven't studied that example, but in other examples I see, they are literally in in Milwaukee going to tear down one parking garage and put up another parking garage. Something gets torn down, metaphorically or literally, to put in the new stuff. So somebody else would have used that land, somebody else might have used those employees, somebody else. And so when you realize maybe Toyota is more economically productive than what it would have taken that place, still, you're suddenly shrinking the sort of comparison, not from everything Toyota brought in, but what's the marginal difference of what Toyota brought in. And I think that on aggregate, who's going to bring in something that's more economically, have a bigger economic impact? Is it going to be your governor, or is it going to be the market? And so where I would say the spending, government intervention is worth it is most in sort of building general infrastructure. If Toyota shows up and they says, in Kentucky, everything's so spread out, and they say, we need better roads because, if we're going to get to Bowling Green, it has to go down this windy little road. That's the sort of place that if you could really see a benefit from it, that you could justify that sort of spending but to particularly bribe one company. And the other thing is the moral hazard. It's like with a bailout. Once one state gives it, then they can ask the next state for even more. And they end up then moving out. And this is what Connecticut did. They did it with them, and they did it with Pfizer and Kilo. My last point, Kilo v. New London was about, first they gave free land to Pfizer in New London. And then the land next to it was this sort of working class neighborhood. And Pfizer said, we don't like that. Can you turn that into something nicer, like a park or an office park or something? And so the New London Development Commission said yes. And they came in, tore down all the houses. Liberals on the Supreme Court gave it the big thumbs up. And now Pfizer has moved across the river. So there's still this field of rubble where Suzette Kilo's house used to be. And now there's an empty, I don't know if somebody's moved into that Pfizer plant, but they abandoned that. So that's another thing you have to weigh in.
You can come up with big companies like Toyota that do what they say they're going to do. But some of these companies, like a Crony, or let's call it the fly-by-night company that comes along and says, I'm going to bring in 10,000 jobs. A lot of times, this stuff never happens. If you go back and, and myriad projects of people you've never heard of, they come back 5 years later and they said, well, actually they came in, they produced 150 jobs and the company didn't do well, so they're gone.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, all these subsidies are gone. And that's what happened with Salinity. So again, it's a question of whenever you start, when government, which is not efficient and usually not very competent, makes those decisions, it's usually not the right decision.
Yeah. They might happen on the right decision. But anyway, Rubio starts in about 25 minutes. So.